everybody. We are doing pandemic makeovers for STEM challenges this week. We are going through some of the winter and Christmas STEM challenges, so you'll be ready right after you come back from break to do some of these. I hope that you have either given some STEM challenges a shot this year or are getting ready to, and that's why you're here. I know a lot of people thought we had to it just seems sort of very difficult to achieve during social distancing and distance learning. And some of them are really hard to adapt and maybe aren't the best choices. But the ones that I'm sharing with you this week are definitely doable. And I'm going in order of the ones that I think are easiest to achieve in terms of not having any idea what materials your kids might have if they're working from home or if they're in class, things that are cheap enough for you to be able to supply each individual student to work on their own. So today's pandemic makeover is on Sled and Slope or Sleigh and Slope, and the name that you choose for it will depend on whether you are doing Christmassy stuff, and then you can do Santa's sleigh if you want, or keep it just purely winter and go for Sled and Slope, which is what I typically do, but that's up to you and your population, your kids, and all that stuff. So let me just bring this right in. As a reminder, we're doing all 5 challenges this week. I'm going to take this little banner off so I'm not blocking any of the slides while I talk. Yesterday, we did Snowman Stretch. Today is Sled and Slope. Tomorrow will be Frozen Fortress. And then we'll get into the last 2 are Christmas challenges. We'll do Reindeer Relay and then Candy Cane Calamity. So every day this week, same time, join me if you are interested. For our challenge today, the goal of this challenge is for your students to design and build a sled and slope to transport riders the furthest distance possible. And you also want that done safely. So I have a lot of slashes in there. If you're doing the Christmas version, you can treat this sort of like, you're doing like a gift bag of like Santa's gifts or whatever. Sometimes what I do is I just use 2 little bows. You'll see some pictures coming up in a moment. 2 little like gift wrapping bows to symbolize 2 gifts, but it really can be any 2 small things. Now, if your kids are at home, you can have them, simply create something out of scratch paper or just take something small to be symbolic. So like little lids can be people. I was looking at something that might have a little bit more weight to it, knowing I'd want a little bit more weight to my sled. Batteries that are dead that I haven't gone to drop off at the recycling. I don't know if it's really recycling, but anyway, the place where it's safe to drop off your batteries so you don't throw them out. I'm going to give you some other suggestions as we go through, but I thought it might be fun for you to see some of the sleds in action. So I'm going to pull in a little video really quickly for you. And this is actually from a training that I did with teachers in Washington State, like a live PD training maybe a year ago. And so one of the things I know a lot of people ask me is how old can these challenges be, used for? Would you use them in high school? I can tell you a room full of adults enjoyed the heck out of themselves working on this STEM challenge. So I don't really think there's a top age limit. And I think this one works down. We'll talk about that when we talk about modifications. Let me show you some examples of what this challenge might look like. Fun, right? And I think you could see, looking at that the materials are extremely simple. So we use cereal boxes. I had some other cardboard scraps. You saw some egg cartons in there. I did have these little plastic figurines, but they're not necessary to be your riders. Like I said, kids can use anything small to symbolize, or they could even make them out of scratch paper or maybe some of their cardboard scraps. You can do this with relatively few materials, and clean trash works really well for these. Let me go ahead and reshare this and kind of get into some of the details of this. And if you have questions while we go, just let me know in the comments. I might not address them right away, but I always come back and check them at the end. So as I mentioned, I gave you some suggestions already for some materials. And here are some others if you happen to have them around, but you don't need all of these things. I do think pretty much cardboard scraps is going to get you where you need to go. You could do that with pretty much just cardboard scraps and then some kind of form of tape. Yesterday, I mentioned using address labels, those ones that they send you in the mail for free. Well, not really for free because they want you to donate, but they do send them for free. So your kids might have some of those on hand, even if they don't have tape. A lot of these things that you see in the picture are sort of nice to have items like pipe cleaners. That's nice. Um, it's nice to have a ruler or measuring tape so you can kind of measure the distance that your sled travels. We're going to talk about that, the terms of like what you want to achieve, like, and to measure as in your goals here in just a sec. Craft sticks and foil sheets are nice too, because a lot of the time the problem with the sleds and the slopes and the combination of the two, it often has to do with friction, right? And that's one of the science concepts we can extend upon. So foil can be a helpful way to smooth that out. But again, none of that's necessary. This is just another example of, you can see this one is sleigh and slope. It's sort of shaped like a Santa sleigh, and it's got some little gifts that we used ornaments and gift bows in this one. But you can see it's another cereal box, and it's just one single cereal box that was used here. Some of the things you might want to consider putting in your criteria and constraints list is that the ramp itself or the slope should be freestanding. That's up to you. You don't really necessarily have to do it that way. 2 or more riders or gifts, you can leave that up to your students as a variable to consider, because they might find that they want to put a little bit more weight in their sled. Where they put the positioning of the riders and the gifts can matter and make an impact. More on that in a sec. I like to require that the sled is an open air vehicle, or you can say that a different way and say, like, you can't turn end over end. And the reason that I say it that way is, well, first of all, if it is a sled, you're probably not going to have that contained in the real world. But also, I don't want them to just design a ball that's going, or a spherical, shape that's going to just roll on and on forever, because the two goals of the challenge are we want the sled to go the farthest distance possible, and we want it to be safe for our riders, which means they can't be ejected. They have to stay in at all times. Now, if you don't like anything that I'm saying right now, you can adjust the criteria and constraints however you like. Use your imagination. These are kind of my preferences. And then I always say no pushing the sled down the slope. They just have to do a release of it. I don't want them to use any of their own power to power the sled down the hill. I just want it released at the top of the slope. A couple of options to consider, again, is to let your students decide how many gifts or riders to include and where they want to place them. I have seen it done in the past, especially with younger grades, like second grade. I haven't personally done this with kinder or first, but I know I have heard teachers tell me that they have. And one of the modifications that teachers in those younger grades will sometimes make is the teacher makes the ramp for the student when they're in class, and everybody tests on the same ramp. I'm not a huge fan of that for most grades. Again, you make the decision. You know your kids best, but I think what's super valuable in this challenge is that combination and testing a variety of different angles and seeing what happens when you change those angles. So I am a big fan of letting kids design their own slopes and do some different tests to see, is the sharper angle really better? A lot of times kids want to do it like this and they think that's going to help it gain the most speed. But then a lot of times the sled will just like hit the ground so hard that it tumbles over the sled. So there's a point at which, you get diminishing returns for that. And a lot of rich discussions can come around, potential and kinetic energy. I'm starting to get into my extensions and get ahead of myself. So let me back up a little bit. And then one other thing to consider when you're doing your telling your kids how they're going to test their measurements is to decide if you want them to just do a bunch of trials and they can measure their best distance. Now, if they're at home, they might not have a measuring tape or a ruler to use. So you'll need to sort of brainstorm some ideas with them, or have them brainstorm in their groups, however that might look, on Flipgrid or shared slides or whatever. What are some ways, or what are some non-standard units of measurement they might be able to use? So maybe it's just they take some kind of marker, like not a marker like Crayola, like something to mark with on the floor, and they just like put like test 1 on the scratch paper, and like, this is the farthest that my sled got in test 1, and they put it on the ground, and then they test it again, and like use different markers like that on the ground to see, are we improving? Are we getting further? Are we doing better? Another thing I wanted to point out with these slopes, if they're working from home and they don't have a lot of materials, or even if they do, I don't necessarily have an issue with them trying some different things that are sort of that they see in their house that they might have that would work well, even if it doesn't necessarily involve a ton of engineering on their part. So, for example, I have this whiteboard. It's just these light whiteboards that I use for trainings, and oh, they're amazing. I love them, and they're pretty lightweight. And it's about 2 feet by about 3 feet, and it's very slick because it's a whiteboard. This would be amazing if I set it up against, maybe a clothing rack. Now, depending on my criterion constraints list, I wouldn't be able to do that necessarily because that would make it not freestanding. It's not standing on its own, but you get the gist. Like there's just a couple of things that you're going to need to think about or just be prepared to get questions from your students. Like, is it okay if I do this? My feeling is yes, it's okay. I would let them try those things out and see what kind of distance they can get in a year like this. Usually in the classroom, every group gets the same materials and they do whatever they can do, their best job with what I've given them. In this year, we've got to loosen up a little bit and understand everyone's going to have different stuff in their house. So we're really having, students should be focused maybe even more than usual on just improving their own designs and not so much comparing their designs to somebody else's who used vastly different materials and had access to things that you didn't have access to. Kids were always going to want to sort of, not all kids, but a lot of kids were always going to sort of want to compete against each other. But in this sort of environment, it does just, we're not starting from a level playing field. So we can't, I would try not to encourage that too much, the competition factor against other teams as much as against your own self. Like what can I do to improve this design and the combination of these two designs? Okay, let's see what else we have here. I think we have some more, just a couple of little reminders on collaboration. I talked a lot about that yesterday in the snowman stretch video, and I don't want to repeat myself today. So what I thought I would do instead is I'll just share with you where you can find that later if you want to. When we're taking measurements, by the way, if you are in class and you have access to a measuring tape or a ruler, I have them take their first measurement from wherever the furthest point is that their sled is at the start position. That would be where I would put the ruler down at 0. And then the furthest out it gets, that's where I do my measurement at the end. Here's another example. We just use paper plates. You can see very, very simple materials, but some extensions you can do on this. This is a very rich challenge in terms of data collection because the students will be doing a lot of tests of their sled going down the ramp. And there are so many variables too. Like I was mentioning earlier, how much stuff is in the sled. Now the kids probably won't have necessarily, you certainly can't rely on them having a kitchen scale or something that can really measure the weight of something that light. They probably won't have access to that, but they can sort of keep track of other types of data, like how many gifts or how many bows did they put in there? Did it make a difference when they shifted them toward the front of the sled versus the back of the sled versus the middle of the sled? Even just tracking the distance trials, each trial that they make is a great thing to have them track their own data, put it in a table, graphing, and then even graphing other data from their classmates, ramp measurements, and if you have older students and they do measurement of angles, and if they have a protractor, if you can depend upon them to have that, measurements like that, the length of the ramp, the height of the ramp, if they have these tools available to them, and have them start looking and considering what sorts of patterns do we see in successful designs. Are the super tall, super steep ramps the ones that worked the best always, or were there times that it didn't? And what can we look for? What can we find? What can we observe that helps us understand what's working well and what's not? Because it's not always just about how tall the ramp is or how steep the ramp is. We also have things like friction at play. The design of the sled is going to be important. Lots of things going on, right? So it can be really rich, as I was saying in discussion, to have kids really look at each other's designs, and the measurements are key to understanding when you're not there in person, how tall is this thing? And what does it really look like if I were there in the room? Then you could have them even to identify and test some variables, create, like I mentioned yesterday, one of my favorite things to do with STEM challenges when it makes sense is if it can be turned into an experiment that they design and then work through the scientific method. So you sort of get the best of both worlds. You get all the great stuff from engineering design process, and you can sort of segue right into scientific methods. So maybe making the same sled and slope, but making it from like using foil on top of it to see if that decreases the friction. They might not know that word or what that means, but a lot of times kids will have sort of an innate sort of understanding that it's like it's smooth, and like if it'll be smoother, then move faster, like on a slide, as opposed to like carpet, or versus their laminate flooring. They know from like having socks on, like it makes a difference the way you slide, right? And then you can use that to kind of get into and introduce the scientific concepts behind it, but see what you can get them to draw out and notice first. I have some more ideas on this in the full video walkthrough on my YouTube channel that I'll share with you in a moment as well. As I was saying, I want to make sure you know where to find things if you want more details on this stuff later. But obviously, simple machines, we're talking about ramps here, potential and kinetic energy, forces in motion, friction, and if you have older students, even speed calculations, if you know that they have a timer with them. And then these do have resources for printable and printable and paperless versions, and like a combination of that. And before I show you the YouTube channel and take a look at the comments to see if I have questions, I wanted to remind you that there is a Grateful for Teachers, sort of like it's a special week, in preparation of Thanksgiving, where some friends and I wanted to thank you. And so we have freebies on some days, and actually the freebies go away tonight. So if you haven't gone to visit, you should do this today. But then there are sales all throughout the week, and there are some really good giveaways, like gift card giveaways, kind of raffle stuff. So make sure that you definitely check that out. And then let me just check one thing before I want to make sure I've got the tab ready for you that I can show you. And then we do questions too. Okay. What do we have here? So Karen wrote, let me bring her in. This is my YouTube channel, by the way. And this is what I was going to show you is that the way that it's organized, there are playlists right here, and I have them organized by just general, there's back to school stuff. There's general PD, getting started with STEM challenges. There's like little tips and stuff like that and that playlist. And then if you just move forward to the winter and Christmas challenges, let me pause that. I don't want to play that. But if you see over here, it'll pop up a window. These are the regular video walkthroughs that I've done for normal years. So you can see some more ideas in Sled and Slope there. But these ones that I'm doing right now with the pandemic makeovers, I'm also adding them throughout the week. So earlier when I mentioned, I talked about collaboration yesterday and a couple different ideas. If you missed that, you can go in and watch it on Snowman Stretch. Okay, or of any of the other ones. So I'm going to take that out. I'm going to bring Karen in. Oh yeah, Karen has this great set of Alaskan sled dog resources. I just love all the winter stuff. This would actually be a great companion for that. That's a good idea, Karen. Do I have discussions about friction and the materials that provide less friction? I have, with the students, sorry, my brain went to a different place for a second. Yeah, what we do is I try to get students to really make observations first. So if we see a sled and slope that work really well together, then we start making observations about it. So what do we notice about it? And a lot of times, some of this stuff is about, the angle of it, or it's tall or whatever. And I'll ask, if they're not coming up with it, like, or offering it right away or making the observations, then I might ask them something. Okay, and what do you notice about what are the materials that are used, and what do you notice about those materials? So if it's a cereal box, and I might ask, this, because the outside where they print all the materials, that's smoother than the other side, right? The other side's rough and unfinished. So I might start asking them, I'll say something like, I wonder if they built it the other way, so that brown part was on top instead of the Honey Nut Cheerios part, or the part with the label. Do you think it would be the same if they had done that? And usually they'll say no. And I'll say, well, why do you think so? Or why don't you think so? And see what I can kind of get out of them. So they'll usually say something like, well, it's rough. And the other one's smooth. So we start kind of like paying attention to that. Depending on how we're doing the discussion, I might write things on the board as they're making observations, just to kind of keep sort of notes for them of what they're saying. More often in a normal year, I would be circulating and walking with them. So in that case, I'm usually just jotting notes down, and then we kind of come back together and sort of like review? What do we remember? What do we notice about these things? And then we'll sort of, as we're going through the different things, sometimes people use foil or they might use a plastic sheet. There could be all different kinds of materials, right? And so I'll ask a question like, what do you think is important if you want the sled to move fast and far? Thinking about what we saw in all of these designs today, what do you think are some of the important design elements, or what are some of the important things you saw that you noticed that they had in common? And so they'll usually say, well, it should be tall, or it should be a long, it should be like a very long slope. If you can make one, maybe that makes a difference either way, or it makes a difference that the materials that are used are smooth. So then we might say, like, what's some other materials that we might want to try? Or what do you think would be interesting to see that you think might make a difference? And they might say something like, well, I wonder if you added like oil or water or some kind of liquid to it, if that would make a difference. And so these are the kinds of things when I'm drawing out, whether we're talking about friction or really anything about the design itself. And this is true of any STEM challenge, whatever it is, when we're trying to find those patterns, I ask a ton of questions to try to see if I can get them to sort of like think about it and make the observation and look for the patterns. The pattern making is key, right? Really looking for what they notice that things have in common. And then we use that as the jumping off point. Well, what else might make a difference, or what else might we want to try? Now, we don't always try those things. In a classroom, I'm not super likely to bring out oil, right? And like make a ton of like a crazy, crazy mess. But if we're in a situation where they're at home and their parent gives them permission, forgot to say that earlier, it's my little sticky note reminder, remind your students they need to ask their parents or their responsible adult if they have permission to use materials and to do the testing before they do it. But yes, I just try to sort of like keep asking questions. And we might not get to the answer in that conversation, like any, serious answers in that conversation. I might not even introduce the word friction necessarily. Depends. It might not work in that situation, or not necessarily work. It kind of depends on time and where we're going. If there's time, I might say something like, I might even just throw something offhand like, oh, this reminds me of something called friction. You know what? We should look up some more things about friction and see what else we can learn and what other materials it might make sense to use. Let me make a note for myself. And then I make that note. And then because we might not be moving into like a science lesson right in that moment. We often are not, because I tended to use my science block for the design and building and testing of STEM challenges. And my other, when I was self-contained, we might be moving into like, oh, now it's time to go to PE, or now it's time to do social studies, or now it's time for ELA. And then we would move into extensions and connections in that way. And then maybe the next day we come back and then we go into, remember yesterday what we were talking about materials and blah, 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 what do we remember that we were learning about that? Oh, let's talk about friction. Or if friction isn't, I still would be very willing to introduce friction, even if it wasn't in my standards necessarily. But if my standards do include forces in motion, I'm going to lean more heavily on their observations around forces in motion than I am around friction if that's not in my particular set of standards for that grade level, if that makes sense. So it's whatever is most connected that I have to do anyway. I know it sounds like have to do, but you get my drift. Okay. All right. And then we have, what about a pull test? Add a string to the front and pull the sled through flour to simulate snow. Then discuss the need for streamlined sleds. Yes, I like that idea. I also like the idea, I meant to say this earlier too, like if they're at home and have access to a hairdryer, I would love to have them do some tests where they're standing in front of the sled or the slope, or have like maybe their parent or a sibling or something. They would need sort of a buddy of some kind to do this. But to have somebody like pointing the hairdryer up the actual slope and have the sled coming down against the wind to see how that impacts how far the sled goes. And then also that gives you the opportunity, just like the idea you suggested, Karen, about streamlining, right? Aerodynamics and things like that. The shape of the front of the sled, how much of a difference does it make? They're going to be kind of like, depend. Oh, and of course that also, what would impact that is the weight of what they've put in the sled as well. A lighter sled's going to be more reactive to wind, right, than something that has a little bit more mass in it. And so that could be a nice place to go with that. I like the idea of the streamlined sled too with the flower. Again, very important to get parent permission for that. If you're in your classroom, it's kind of manageable. I mean, it can get messy. What might work out is if they can go outside, if there's a playground that has sand, you can use the sand in place of the flower, and then you won't have anything to clean up. So that might work too if there's enough space on the playground and you can go out and use that. Okay. Great ideas, Karen. I'm loving. Thank you so much for showing up today and tomorrow, because I'm loving where you're making the ideas that you're suggesting, and I'm also really enjoying the questions because it's making me think. Okay, I don't see, and hi, Carrie. Nice to see you. Don't worry that you're late. You can always go back and watch the beginning. So I think that's it for today. Tomorrow we're going to do Frozen Fortress, and this one's a little bit trickier for the distance learning and social distancing, but it's not impossible. I'm just going to give you some different suggestions other than using the mini marshmallows, because I think that's probably unrealistic. But last reminder for today, there are some freebies and some like $1 deals and $2 deals that are expiring tonight in just a few hours. And then tomorrow, Snowman Stretch is on sale for the hybrid resource that has the print version and the paperless version is half off tomorrow and Thursday. And then there was another one too, but I don't remember what it is, but you can see it on the website. And don't forget to scroll all the way down on this website, because they're like Teachers Pay Teachers gift cards. I think there's Amazon gift cards, resource giveaways, lots of different stuff. The giveaways are happening on Friday, so you can enter anytime, as many times. There's like a bunch of different ways you can enter, so you can do all that. And then I will see you tomorrow, same time, same place. And we'll talk about another winter challenge, because you can absolutely do STEM. And I want to tell you one more thing. I've been getting a lot of feedback lately on my Teachers Pay Teachers store from teachers who are saying they're hearing from their parents of their students how much their kids are enjoying doing things away from the screens and doing hands-on activities. So if you've got any reluctance on this at all in your heart, just give it one try. And I would, again, recommend either Snowman Stretch that I went over yesterday or Sled and Slope that we just went over just now. I think those are the two most manageable ones. The rest of them are not bad or not super hard. But if you're just kind of like, oh, I'm a little nervous, one of these two is the one to start with. Okay. All right. Have a wonderful evening. I will see you tomorrow. Bye for now.